Welcome back to the Bone Physiology playlist. In this video, we're going to go over a special type of bone formation that occurs in utero for the formation of all of the bones beneath the skull with the exception of the clavicle, and this is called endochondral ossification. So that's one very important distinction I do want to make. Endochondral ossification basically, for all intents and purposes, forms all the bones beneath the skull with the exception of the clavicle. Okay, the skull has different methods, i.e. intramembranous ossification, that help to develop that. But in any case, a very large chunk of this process occurs in utero for the fetus. And then a little tiny amount actually occurs once the child is born. Okay? Here's kind of the central idea behind endochondral ossification. The synthesis of it is going to require something called hyaline cartilage. And if you sort of break down the name endochondral ossification, chondro is the prefix that symbolizes cartilage. And in fact, this particular method of ossification, as you can see here, requires something referred to as the cartilage model of ossification. And so this system right here that you see, this picture, is representing the cartilage tissue that was made by cells that are referred to as chondrocytes. And sometimes people use the term chondroblast to describe these because blast typically means you're building a tissue. But actually the correct term to describe these cartilage synthesizing cells is the chondrocyte. And if you want more detail on chondrocytes or chondroblasts, you can certainly go back and review the previous video. Here we're just going to assume that you have a basic understanding of what they do. Okay? So what's happening in the initial stages of bone development is you have this cartilage model. Okay, it's very small compared to what the size of the final bone will be. And initially what's going to happen is blood vessels, as you can see right here, this is a blood vessel right here. Blood vessels are essentially going to penetrate the very exterior of the cartilage. Okay? And you have to understand that on the exterior of the cartilage, I have these cells called mesenchymal cells. And whenever you hear the term mesenchymal, you need to think kind of a baby cell. These are different types of stem cells that can differentiate into other types of cells. And it turns out that upon stimulus, whenever nutrients and certain molecules get to those mesenchymal cells, they will differentiate into cells that we're used to hearing about called osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are cells that start to make bone tissue or osseous tissue. And hopefully what you can see by the second picture is you can actually see an outer layer of bone right here. That it doesn't appear like this. They're just trying to give you some perspective. This actually exists. It exists all over the three-dimensional surface of the bone. And this structure is called the bone collar. This is called the bone collar, and as we see, it's synthesized by osteoblasts. Okay? And at this time, notice what it says here. We have enlarging chondrocytes. So these cells that occupy the cartilage, they actually made the cartilage, they're starting to enlarge. And if you go back to one of the previous videos where we talked about chondrocytes, we know for a fact that they synthesize things like collagen fibrils type 1. They make and secrete hyaluronic acid, chondroitin sulfate. They also make things like glycoproteins and proteoglycans and things like that. But one of the things that happens when these chondrocytes begin to enlarge is their physiology sharply changes. And actually, if you Google these type of cells, they actually make a distinction between what we call normal chondrocytes and enlarged chondrocytes. And actually what happens is the chondrocytes, when they become enlarged, they start making a new enzyme that wasn't present before, so their gene expression changes. The enzyme is called alkaline phosphatase, and usually they abbreviate it as ALP. Alkaline phosphatase. What alkaline phosphatase does is it promotes the calcification of the cartilage extracellular matrix. And so the ground substance becomes very calcified. So we could say in here it's very calcified. Okay? Now, there are some blood vessels that do penetrate the exterior of the bone where the bone collar is, but the point is whenever this ground substance or this matrix becomes calcified, it becomes essentially impermeable to nutrients. And this essentially is going to cause cartilage. This is essentially going to cause chondrocyte death. Okay? And when the chondrocytes die, okay, it kind of creates this central clearing where the cells died. Okay, you could sort of think of this central clearing as kind of being in this region right here. And if you think about the logic as to why that would be, well, that region is sort of the farthest away from the blood vessels. And you could imagine that the blood vessels are also kind of penetrating from the other side as well, and also completely 360 degrees around the bone. So that region in the center of what will become the diaphysis of the bone, it's the farthest away from the blood vessels. And so logic would dictate that that's the first region that dies. And so you create a central clearing. Now, there's another thing that happens around this time. The periosteal bud is a network of blood vessels and lymphatic vessels that's going to penetrate the region in here where the chondrocytes died. And so you have this central clearing. And what it allows for is it allows for activity of osteoblasts. And the osteoblasts, which I'll abbreviate as OB, the osteoblasts start making spongy bone. So the osteoblasts start making spongy bone. Around the same time, we also have osteoclasts, OC. But when we talked about them in the previous videos, we talked about how they degrade bone tissue. Well, it turns out that they actually have another function where they're actually able to degrade cartilage tissue. In this case, it's going to be hyaline. So once the periosteal bud penetrates here, you get degradation of some of the hyaline cartilage that's in there, and that creates an even bigger space in there. And then also what's going to happen is the osteoblasts will start secreting spongy bone, and then the osteoclasts will also degrade that. So not only will the osteoclasts degrade the cartilage, they will also degrade the spongy bone. And so what that does is it creates a central cavity. And this cavity is referred to as the marrow cavity, or sometimes they'll call it the medullary cavity. Okay, very important terminology. And the medullary cavity is going to basically occur in the center of what will essentially become the diaphysis. So you have this dynamic that's occurring inside what will become the bone. The osteoclasts are degrading the hyaline cartilage where the chondrocytes have died. And then what happens is osteoblasts are able to synthesize the spongy bone. Then the osteoclasts come back, and then they degrade the spongy bone. So the osteoclasts' function here is twofold. They degrade the hyaline cartilage, where the chondrocytes have died, and then they degrade the newly made spongy bone. And you can imagine what that's doing is it's creating a bigger and bigger space here. So notice what happens as I go from the third picture here to the fourth picture, right? That space that's inside the center of what will become the diaphysis is essentially getting larger and larger. And that's, again, what we call the marrow cavity or the medullary cavity. And it's filled with blood vessels. Okay? Now, everywhere else in the bone, particularly when you're going towards what will become the epiphyses, okay, this region up here as we go up in this direction, kind of right here, and then we come down here and we go downwards, okay, that region right there still has active chondrocytes. And so cartilage is still continuously being synthesized upward and downward. And that actually increases the length of the long bone. Okay, so at those points, the chondrocytes have not completely died, and so they're still actively secreting matrix, and so you get an increase in the length of the bone. This system that I just talked about, where we have the osteoclast degrading hyaline cartilage, we have osteoblasts making spongy bone, which will eventually be degraded by osteoclast, that system is what we refer to as the primary ossification center of the bone. Okay? It turns out that what's going to happen usually once the baby is born in the very initial stages of life, you'll get what's called the formation of a secondary ossification center. Okay? And we're actually getting ready to look at that now. But one thing I want to do very quickly is I want to discuss a concept with you called the epiphyseal cartilage. So up here at the top, in this region up here, this is what will essentially become the epiphyses. Okay, there's one on the top, and then there's also obviously one on the bottom in the case of this particular long bone. But what you have here, right between the medullary cavity or the marrow cavity and the actual epiphysis, you have something referred to as the epiphyseal cartilage. Okay? This is basically a region of the bone that will continuously increase the synthesis of cartilage. And so, like as you could imagine, what's going to happen is it will continuously increase in cartilage, and so the bone will actually increase in length along the diaphysis of the bone. Okay? This is the mechanism by which bone growth occurs. So what's going to happen is more and more cartilage is going to be laid down at the epiphyseal cartilage region, and then some of it's going to be ossified by osteoblasts and the mechanisms that we talked about earlier, i.e. the primary ossification center. But what's going to happen basically up until about the age of 20 is the epiphyseal cartilage is going to continue to elongate. And in another video, we'll actually look at the mechanism to see how that occurs and how these long bones increase in length. But now what I want to do is I want to shift the focus now toward what is happening basically at the epiphyses. Okay, and in large part, this is going to occur once the child is born. Okay, but what's essentially going to happen is you're going to have a similar thing that happens where you're going to have some of these some of these chondrocytes that die here in the epiphyses. And once again, I think you have the intuition that they're going to become enlarged and they're going to start secreting alkaline phosphatase and all that stuff that we talked about earlier. And so what's going to happen is you're going to get all of this spongy bone that forms right here, basically in the center of the epiphysis of the bone. And what's going to happen here is you're going to get a continued synthesis of spongy bone that kind of radiates outward in these directions. So the spongy bone is going to increase in synthesis. Okay, so I'm going to scroll down here so you can look at this picture. This is a really good picture indicating what happens at the secondary ossification center. Notice we basically don't have a medullary cavity. We have what we call complete ossification at the secondary ossification center. And part of it is, initiated by these blood vessels. I think you have an intuition of that. But notice what happens is we get, in general, a complete ossification, except for the fact, I'll do this in purple, that we have a layer of cartilage here on the tip of the epiphyses that is not ossified. This is called the articular cartilage, and it has some really important implications in medicine because this cartilage, in general, is not ossified. But what happens is you can actually degrade over time this articular cartilage. And so I think you would have the intuition then, if you degrade this, then the exterior surface of the epiphyses is now exposed. And basically up here, I think you have the intuition that there's some joint here, right? Maybe this could be something like the femur, and then, down here would be the knee joint and all that stuff. But the idea is that when you have this articular cartilage, it articulates in the joint. And so there's also another bone that's going to be present at the joint. And so the articular cartilage prevents bone-on-bone friction, which would really cause pain. But if you have deterioration of the articular cartilage, then now what you can have are the epiphyses of bone that rub up against one another. And this situation in which you have deterioration of the articular cartilage, it causes intense pain. And this type of situation has a name. It's called osteoarthritis. Osteoarthritis. And it causes intense pain because you have the epiphyses of the bone that are now rubbing up against one another. And that causes all sorts of frictional problems and so forth. Okay? But hopefully you have a little bit of an intuition on how these things occur. So what's essentially happening is basically you have the chondrocytes that synthesize the cartilage, and then eventually you form an ossification center, like in the case of the primary ossification center, where you have degradation of the hyaline cartilage by osteoclasts, and then you have the synthesis of bone tissue that occurs. In the case of the center of the bone in these long bones in the diaphysis, you have spongy bone, but what's interesting is actually out here on the exterior of the bone, you actually have a different type of bone tissue, which is actually the one we looked at in lab, called compact bone. And no, I don't really require you to know, where exactly we have compact bone or spongy bone, but what I think you should realize is that we do actually have spongy bone that's out here in the epiphysis. So if you actually come down here, you should notice that out here we do have spongy bone. And then over here on the edges of the bone of the diaphysis, where the bone collar essentially is, this is where we have the compact bone. And hopefully you can take a look at this picture and kind of reason through that. Okay? But in any case, the bone itself is made by osteoblasts. And this process that we essentially just looked at, this is called endochondral ossification. Remember that this is happening basically for every bone beneath the skull except for the clavicle, which is done through intramembranous ossification. And actually the next video that we're going to have is actually going to be looking at intramembranous ossification. And I think what you'll see is that this is the only one of the two processes that involves cartilage. So this involved what we called it down here the cartilage model of ossification, which is involving endochondral ossification. Intramembranous ossification is very different, and hopefully you'll stick around for that video. See you then.